So with your permission, before we start the daf for today, that's Memtes, I just want to review what we call in Yiddish Eisevenik, the Gemara that leads into this sugya, because otherwise, if we don't recall it, we're sort of like in the middle, we're jumping into the middle of the sugya, but we won't read the Gemara inside that follows the Mishnah on daf Mem Ches Amid Beis. We'll just sort of summarize the highlights of the Gemara. The Mishnah had already established that according to Rabbi Yossi, when the leaves fall off the Asherah tree, they, together with the soil, will fertilize the growth of the vegetables that he planted under the Asherah tree. And Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that zev gorem is osur, which means the combination of the leaves that are AvodaZara from the Asherah tree plus the soil, which is heter. So you have the isur and the heter together working in tandem, and the product of that partnership is going to be prohibited. It's osur ba'anoah. The Rabbanan, on the other hand, reject Rabbi Yossi, and they're of the opinion that there's no problem in planting your vegetables under the Asherah tree if it's not a shade issue. We'll get to that. If the Asherah tree is going to provide shade during the summer months, but at least during the winter months, when there's no issue of shade and the only issue is fertilizer, that's not a problem because zev gorem is mutter. The Gemara had posited a contradiction, both Rabbi Yossi against Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan against Rabbanan, from the case of destroying the idol, pulverizing it, converting it into dust, whether or not you're permitted to throw the dust to the wind, because although Rabbi Yossi permitted it, the Rabbanan prohibited it, because what's going to happen is that the dust may fall into a field and then fertilize the field. So here everything is just the opposite, because it's going to be Rabbi Yossi who is makil, and he's the one who advocates throwing the dust of the AvodaZara into the wind. And yet, the Rabbanan, on the other hand, are going to be machmir in that case, where they were makil in the case of the leaves that fell from the Asherah tree because of zev zegori mutter. The Gemara says that it could be that we can resolve the contradiction between the two statements of Rabbi Yossi by saying that in the case where he's preoccupied with destroying the AvodaZara, so we don't have any rabbinic gzeros, and we're not afraid that he'll come to benefit from it, as opposed to the case of the leaves that fall from the Asherah tree. There he's not in any way preoccupied with destroying the Asherah tree. But what are we going to do to resolve the contradiction between the Rabbanon and the Rabbanan? And at that point, the Gemara went as far as to throw out the possibility of epuch, that maybe we should switch around the names of Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan. But the Gemara offers a second possibility, that we can retain the original statements as quoted and attributed to Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan, and we can resolve the contradiction between the Rabbanan and the Rabbanan by saying that the Rabbanan hold that a certain principle that we apply, which I'll try to explain from Psulia Mukdashim, that when we calculate whether a person has benefited from something, we have to also consider weighing the losses as well. And therefore, although during the winter, these vegetables might gain in their growth the fertilizing element of the leaves coming from the Asherah tree, but nevertheless, the total assets versus deficits is in the negative, because what's going to happen is that as a result of the loss of the leaves, there wouldn't be, that element of shade that's necessary here to block the sun and so forth and so on. So now the Gemara wants to suggest that there's another statement of Rabbi Yossi that seems to indicate that Zevazeh Gorem is mutter. So again, in the absolute case of the leaves coming down from the Asher tree, Rabbi Yossi held that's prohibited, because the growth that you plant at the foot of the tree will benefit in a Zevazeh Gorem situation from the leaves that fertilize the land. But yet, Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that you can take a branch from an orla tree, which is a problem, and the fruits of the orla tree are prohibited by law for the first 3 years, and you could take that branch and you could graft it onto another tree, which is not orla, and the fruits are mutter. And that's the first line here on our daf for today, Memtes, Shimnota v'hivrich v'hirkiv mutter, which means that Rabbi Yossi is holding that since the fruits that will grow on the second tree, which was not an orla tree, that received its grafting from an orla tree, those fruits are mutter because of Zevazeh Gorem. Those fruits are a product of both the orla tree and the non-orla tree. So how do we reconcile the two statements of Rabbi Yossi? Because on the one hand, Rabbi Yossi seems to indicate that Zevazeh Gorem is asur, and therefore the leaves that are coming down from the Asherah tree to fertilize the vegetables at the bottom of the tree are asur. But on the other hand, he allows you to take the fruits from a non-orla tree where the grafting was coming from an orla tree. And that's where we're up to here, v'chitema, and we're going to read now the second line on Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph. I just need a 1 second break to lift up the Gemara because I'm not succeeding here. The table is much lower. Okay. Maybe this will work for me. We'll try it. This is what happens when you try to combine Daf Yomi in Masechet AvodaZara with a vacation. Okay, so v'chi tema, maybe we'll answer the following. Shani le Rabbi Yossi bein shar isur levodos kolchav. Maybe Rabbi Yossi was only machmir for Zevazeh Gorem in the case of AvodaZara when the leaves are falling from the Asherah tree. But in the case of Orla, which we call Shar Isurim, then Rabbi Yossi is Mekil and he relies on Zevazeh Gorem Mutter. The Gemara rejects that. He says, Umishani Levatanya, I'm going to give you a case where even in AvodaZara, Rabbi Yossi is going to be Mekil on Zevazeh Gorem Vatanya. So now we're talking about a sacrifice of an idol worshiper, and the animal now has, they take the blood, and again, this is amazing to me, but they even get the manure of the animal and they use it as fertilizer. So Sodeshen is davla bezevel avodas kolchavim, v'chein parashen is patma bekarshine avodas kolchavim. So you have now a field that was fertilized by the manure of takrovis avodas kolchavim, or alternatively, a cow that was fattened by Karshine Avodas Kochavim. Now, I don't know if the Karshinim were actually worshipped, or maybe the Karshinim were coming from growths that while they were growing, they were used for idolatry, whatever it might be. And yet, when we found a contradiction between two brisos, Tani Chada Soda Tizara Parati Shoche Vitanya Ida Soda Tivra Uparati Teroze, according to one brisa, we're going to permit both the field that received its fertilizing agent from the manure of Avodas Kochavim and the cow that was fed by Karshinim of AvodaZara. In both cases, according to one brisa, go ahead and enjoy the benefit of the field from the manure and of the cow that was fattened up by these Karshinim. But the other brisa says no, that Sada Tibar, you have to leave the Sada fallow for the amount of time that you could measure that the fertilizer no longer is a positive beneficial agent. And para teiraza, and let the para be starved in order to counter that time period in which the para was eating from the karshinim of AvodaZara. And we thought that to reconcile these two brisos, we would offer the machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. My love, ha Rabbi Yossi v'ha Rabbanan. So it means that Rabbi Yossi is the one who's going to allow you to plant in the field. He doesn't require you to allow the field fallow. He's going to allow you to slaughter the cow, this fat cow that was fattened by the Karshinim of AvodaZara, and that's based on the principle of Zev Gorim Mutter. Whereas the Rabbanan, who were machmir, and they say, no, you can't plant in this field. You have to let it lie fallow to neutralize the added benefit of the manure that was fertilizing the field, the manure that came from Tekrovos Avodas Kochavim. And in the case of the para, you got to starve the para and again counter, or shall we say, neutralize the positive benefit of the karshinim of Avodas Kochavim. So now again we have a stira, because we see clearly that even in the case of Avodas Kochavim, nevertheless, Rabbi Yossi is going to be mekil and allow you to benefit from the final product of a Zev Gorim situation. And that is in contradiction to our Mishnah, which establishes in the name of Rabbi Yossi that when the leaves will fall from the Asherah tree and fertilize the vegetables that you planted at the foot of the Asherah, then you have a problem. It's also low. So the Gemara says, you know what? We're not going to reconcile the stira in the two brisos regarding the field that was fertilized from manure of Tekrovos Avodas Kochavim, or the parah that was fattened through the karshinim of Tekrovos AvodaZara, by introducing Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon. But rather, Enoch Hinami, Rabbi Yossi is always going to be machmir in the case of AvodaZara, of Zev Gorim, and that's why he prohibits the vegetables on the bottom of the Asherah tree because of the leaves that fall in. But we're going to reconcile this machlokes regarding Takrovos Avodas Kochavim and Zev Gorim with a different machlokes, and attribute the two brisos respectively to two different Tanoim. Which Tanoim? Ha Rabbi Eliezer v'ha Rabbanan. So we're about to enter into a sugya of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan, in which the subject of that machlokus is going to be Zev Gorem in a situation of truma. Because truma, of course, is also lizorim with misa b'dei shamayim. And now we're going to say that the machlokas between the two brisos regarding the whether it be the field with the manure that fertilized it, whether it be the cow that was fattened by the kashinim of AvodaZara, that machlokas of the two brisos is really attributable to the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer, and the Rabban. So now the Gemara is going to journey to try to find where is this Rabbi Eliezer and Rabban. Ilema, if it's Rabbi Eliezer Rabban, this CR, now CR has to do with truma. It's a leavening agent that's added to a dough in order to help the dough rise. And in this case, we have a Mishnah in Masechet Orla that states that Sa'ar shel chulin v'shel truma shenaflu l'tocha isa v'lo bazeh kedei l'chametz v'lo bazeh kedei l'chametz. So the measured amount of the sa'ar, which is chulin means it's not truma and it's mutter, and the measured amount of truma, meaning of si'ar of truma that fell in, each and every one of them in and of themselves would not be sufficient to generate the fermentation, the chimutz of this dough, but together as combined forces, they will be machametz the isa. They will cause the leavening of the dough. It's tarfa v'chimutza. So now the question is, can a Yisrael eat this bread after it's baked that was created partially, at least, by the leaven of truma? Rabbi Eliezer Omer, achar achron aniba. It depends on what sequence he added these two se'ars. If let's give the simple case, if the se'ar of chulin went first, and then he added to that mixture, to that dough, the se'ar of truma, then it's the se'ar of truma that finalizes the process of leavening, and therefore this dough becomes asur to a non-Kohen. Chachamim omer, bein shenafal isel chatchil, bein shenafal isel levasof, eino asur. Why? The Chachamim are mekil, and they permit the non-Kohen to eat the dough, because it doesn't matter, even if the CR of Truma was the Makav Patish and was added last, it's still Zev Zegore, because in and of itself, the Sa'ar of Truma could not have generated the leavening. So less the Sa'ar of Truma had within it, independent of the CR of Chulin, the power to create leavening. V'yomer Abaye, now Abaye is going to limit the statement of Rabbi Eliezer, and the Gemara is going to, this is a very unusual type of Gemara. The Gemara doesn't understand where Abaye is coming from. The Gemara completely rejects Abaye, but in any event, what did Abaye say? Lo shanu el shekodav v'silek esa isur. Ava lo kodav v'silek esa isur is asur. When Rabbi Eliezer says, wait a minute, let's see which CR, whether it was Chulin or Truma, fell in last and clinched and completed the process of leavening, that only applies because he took out the Sa'ar of Truma. But let's say the Sa'ar of Truma remained inside this dough. That's called Lo Kada V'Silek Esa Isur. Then it doesn't make any difference, says Abaye, as to which came first and which came second. It's always going to be Asur. And the reason for that is because the CR of Truma is inside the dough, and it's be'en, it's intact, and it's not batel. In other words, it comes out that Rabbi Eliezer, according to Abaye, holds that the dough is also because the last fermenting agent that was placed into the dough was the siar of truma, the siar of isur, and it means that zev v'zeh gorem is also according to Rabbi Eliezer. So the Rabbanan on the other hand said it doesn't matter which came first and which came second. The dough is always automatically permitted to a non-Kohen because zev v'zeh gorem is mutter. So when we had the stira between two brisos about the fertilized field from the manure of Tikrovos, or the cow that was fattened up from the kashidim of AvodaZara, that stira should be resolved not by introducing Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim, but rather with the leaves that fell from the Asherah tree, but rather by introducing the Machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan with regard to the Sa'ar that fell into the Esau. Now, let me just add one sentence, which again we don't have time for this, but in Abaye's frame of reference, im lo kadam v'silek, then what's happening is that since he didn't remove the se'ar of truma immediately, he left it there long enough that it could, in Yiddish we say uftu, right? It could impact on the dough to cause the leavening. And if that be the case, then even if the sa'ar of truma came first, says Abaye, Rabbi Eliezer would still prohibit the dough to the non-Kohen because zev v'zeh gorem is awesome. Now, if not for Abaye, we could have suggested that zev v'zeh gorem is mutter even according to Rabbi Eliezer. Just that Rabbi Eliezer holds that this is not really comparable to zev v'zeh gorem because since he added the si'ar of truma last, it's the si'ar of truma that sort of like independently on its own, with its own power, created the leavening. So the Gemara rejects Abaye outright and says, "Mimai, how does Abaye know this? How does he know the time of the Rebbe Eliezer Kid Abaye based on your logic? Abaye Dilma time of the Rebbe Eliezer Mishum Tiacher Achronani Ba." All Rabbi Eliezer is talking about is what came last and clinched the process of fermentation. He's not talking about zev v'zeh gorem. Igomer b'sura asura. If the clincher was the siar of truma, which is the isur for non-kohen, then it's asur. V'igomer b'etera mutar. But if the last thing that created the fermentation was the addition of the siar of chulin, then it's mutar. Bein salke, bein lo salke. It makes no difference whether or not this still is the siar of truma. It was removed. It wasn't. Forget about all that. It's just a question of how we combine these two, agents, these two chemical agents. And the question is, which was the last chemical agent to effectuate the change and create the dough? So if this be the case, then Abaye, you're out to lunch over here. You want to tell me that Rabbi Eliezer is based on zev v'zeh gorem also. That's not so. So at this point, the Gemara is hard-pressed. We have to find a different statement of Rabbi Eliezer to attribute to him the shita that zev v'zeh gorem is also. You can't prove it from the case of truma and chulin, because in that case, Rabbi Eliezer is operating with a totally different principle. Acher achron Azlina. Ella, but rather Rabbi Eliezer upon him. Okay, this is a Mishnah later on. Very soon we'll get to it here in Masechet AvodaZara. And it has to do with taking the wood from an Asherah tree and using it as fuel to heat up his oven. and bake his bread in the oven. Now, what happens? This nan notal heimenu eitzin. He chopped off the wood of the Asherah tree. Asur ba'no. Right? The Asherah tree is also ba'no. The wood from the branches of the Asherah tree is therefore also ba'no. He said, there's a tanur. And if he uses this wood to heat up his oven as fuel. Now here, Rabosai, we got to get into a little physics here, which again, I don't know anything about physics, but the metzius is that there's something called a tanur chadash and a tanur yashan. There's an old oven. Again, the word old is a little bit strange. It doesn't mean how old it was. When was it manufactured in China? But what it means is, was it used in the past, or is this the first time it's being used? Why? Because the first time in those days that they heated up their ovens, the heat of the fuel that's coming into the oven completes the oven. The oven has to be strengthened. Therefore, chadash yutatz, since he created this oven, the final process in creating the oven was the fuel that came from the Asherah tree. Therefore, the oven has to be, so to speak, smashed to smithereens. But Yashal, if on the other hand, he's already strengthened the oven, he doesn't need this fuel in the heating element to strengthen the oven has already been used in the past, is then Yutzan. All he has to do is wait until the heat cools off, and then he could use the oven. Because now when he bakes his bread in the oven, he's not benefiting ostensibly from the wood that he took from the Asherah tree. So again, as far as the oven itself is concerned, no problem. The oven has not been affected by the, the tree, the wood of the Asher. Why? Because it's Yashan. However, now, what happens if he bakes the bread? Just 1 second. Now, what's 1 second? Off of Boas Hapas, I'm sorry. Just want to get this through. Oh, okay, very good. Now, the Mishnah is a bit ambiguous, and it can be interpreted in two ways, and both ways are correct. Either off a bow, the word bow here refers to the new oven, and then it's irrelevant whether the oven cooled off from the original fueling from the Asherah tree, or it did not cool off, or the bow refers to the Yashan, but we're talking about where he bakes his bread in this old oven before the heat from the fuel of the Asherah cools down. And therefore, if he eats that bread, he is benefiting from the Asherah, and therefore it's awesome. Okay, if that bread, which was also because it was created through the Asherah wood, gets mixed up with other breads, then they're all prohibited, and we don't apply the law of bittul. Now, normally, yavesh b'yavesh, again, we don't have the time to get into it now, but it's batal b'rov. So if this one bread got mixed up with two loaves of bread, everything should be mutter. In fact, according to the Rashba, you can eat all three loaves. But in any event, But here you wouldn't apply the halacha of bittul barov, apparently because it's a davar chashuv. Okay, again, that's way beyond the parameters of our daf. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yolich Hano Liamamelach. I don't get it, says Rabbi Eliezer. You're worried about the fact that if he eats this bread, he is benefiting from the fuel that was generated by the wood of the Asherah tree. How much does that wood sell for in the market? Let's say it's worth 10. He could have easily spent that 10 and bought wood from something that's not an Asherah. So he just saves himself the 10. So therefore, let him take the 10, we'll call it shkolim, and throw it into the Yamamelech, which is just an expression that means destroy it. So that now he gets absolutely no benefit from eating the bread that was baked from the fuel that came from the Asherah tree. But the Chacham say, Ein pigeon lavodas kochav. We have a principle in avodas kochav that there's no such thing as pigeon. This is going to come up again and again. And therefore, you want to do this kind of pigeon in which you take the equivalent value of the AvodaZara, namely the market value of the wood of the Asherah tree, and you want to exchange it for something else. We don't accept that. But in any event, the main point here is that both Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan agree that the bread itself is asur. Now, the bread was created, admittedly, by the fuel that came from the wood of the Asherah tree. But on the other hand, there were other elements that entered into the equation. And it wasn't just, the wood, magically turned into a piece of bread, a loaf of bread, but you had to use the oven and the walls of the oven, and the heat has to be trapped in, so forth and so on. So it's zevazeh gorem, and this could be the source that Rabbi Eliezer holds. Zevazeh gorem is awesome. Spek the Gemara, Rabbana de Pliga Leid Rabloza Mininu. Now we want to find the Rabbanon. Once we've established that Rabbi Eliezer holds Zevazeh gorem is also, now let's identify the Rabbanon who hold that Zevazeh gorem is mutter. Ilem Rabbanon di eitzim. If you're going to talk about the Rabbanon of the fuel that was generated by the tree and the wood of the Asherah tree, they were even more stringent than Rabbi Eliezer. They didn't even allow this trick of throwing the hana into the Yamamelech. So you're going to have to find a different sheet of the Rabbanon to prove that they hold Zevazeh gorem is mutel Rabbanon de Siyar. Well, guess what? We had the Mishnah of Siyar, and the Rabbanon said it doesn't matter which Siyar came first, whether the Siyar of Truma went in first to this dough, or whether the Siyar of Chulin went in first. In either case, it's mutter, and the non-Kohen is allowed to eat that dough. And the reason for that is because neither one of these two fermenting agents, leavening agents, could have in and of itself created the leavening. So it's Zevazeh gorem. They only combine their powers together. Frek the Gemara, no. But you want to establish that the Rabbanan will hold Zevazeh gorem is mutter, even in a case of avodas kochav. So, for example, if the leaves fall down from the Asherah tree and they fertilize the vegetables at the bottom, then the Rabbanan will be makel. How do you know that? It can't be the Rabbanan that you prove it from the Rabbanan of Eitzim, because the Rabbanan of Eitzim are talking about the Isa Truma. They're not talking about the Isa Avodas Kochavim. And maybe in Avodas Kochavim they would agree that Zevazeh gorem is also goes to the Chumrah of Avodas Kochavim. El Yolam ha Rabbi Yossi. Let's go back to our original position that Rabbi Yossi is going to be the author of that brisa that permitted the field that was fertilized by the manure of Tekrovos Avodas Kochavim, permitted the slaughtering of the cow that was fattened up by the Karshidim of Avodas Kochavim. And that's the same Rabbi Yossi who allowed you to take the grinding, pulverized dust of the idol and throw it into the wind, even though it will fertilize the fields, because of Zev Zegori Mutter. V'harabbanon, and the brisa which says that you're not allowed to allow the manure to fertilize the field or the karshinim to fatten the cow, they are the Rabbanon. And the Rabbanon were the ones who said, hey, Rabbi Yossi, we object to your throwing the dust of the Avodas Kochav into the wind. Yeah, but the only problem is, if now the Gemara is saying that according to Rabbi Yossi, he would allow the planting of the field and the slaughtering of the cow because Zev Zegorim is mutter, and that's why he allows you to pulverize and spread the dust. What are we going to do with Rabbi Yossi about the leaves of the Asherah tree that fertilized the vegetables and Rabbi Yossi prohibited? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi l'divrei d'Rabbanakum l'didi Zev Zegorim mutter. I, in fact, hold that Zev Zegorim is mutter. And therefore, if you ask me whether you're allowed to plant vegetables at the feet of the Asherah tree, even though the leaves are going to come down, I myself would permit it. Haraya, I permitted the dust that flew to the fields and fertilized the fields. But But after all, you held that Zev Zegorim is asur, and that's the Rabbanon of the summertime planting of the vegetables at the foot of the Asherah tree, because the leaves and the foliage of the Asherah tree will cause shade from the heat burning sun that could dry up the vegetables, and that's also because Zev Zegorim is asur. Oduli mias af yirokas v'mosak shamim. In other words, you only prohibited the planting of the vegetables at the foot of the Asherah tree during the summer months, but you allowed it during the winter months, because during the winter months, the vegetables are crying out for as much sunlight as they can get. So the foliage of the Asherah tree, which is stealing and diminishing the sunlight, is only negative. But nevertheless, you should be modeh that even in the wintertime, you can't plant the vegetables at the foot of the Asherah tree because of the fertilizing element of the leaves. For Rabbanan Kida Amar Rav Mari Bered Rav Kahana, and that goes back to the Psuli HaMukdashim business, where, as I told you, there's still a vestige of Kedusha even after the behema becomes pasul, and therefore after it's shchita, you're not allowed to flay it in such a way that the butcher will make holes in the meat, and that's disrespectful for the Psuli HaMukdashim, which still retains a certain element of Kedusha. So we look at the overall benefit or deficit. And here too, when we look at the overall benefit or deficit and we weigh the fertilizing element in the leaves versus the loss when the leaves fall of shade and so forth and so on, then we come to the conclusion it's not called a benefit. We pass like Rabbi Yossi, and Zev Zegorim is mutter. We're going to soon see the next Mishnah, which assumes that Zev Zegorim is also. Hahu ginsa is a gina, a garden. There is davel bezivil davos kochavim shalach ravamar kami de Rabbi Yossi family hochi om Rabbi Yehuda halacha Rabbi Yossi. So it means the following: that even though this field was fertilized by the manure of Tikrovas Avodas Kochavim, nevertheless it's mutter And it's a case of zev gorem because the soil is going to produce the vegetation together with this fertilizer. So the fertilizer is only one element in the equation.